2 that will blow your mind. About my second time through it, I got this idea for a new song, kind of like a journey to the center of your mind type of trip. And I was thinking we could take some quotes from Leary's translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Here's what I got so far.
Like the proverbial frog in the pot, happy to stay put as long as the heat is turned up slowly, Western culture, as in the parable we just saw, has become increasingly steeped in a virtual witch's cauldron of occult thought and practice. What began as an excursion into paganism on the part of a handful of philosophers, artists, educators, and other so-called free thinkers has now become part of the very fabric of Western culture. From sex magic to tattooing, New Age religion to open Satan worship, occult practices that have been progressively eradicated by the advancing influence of the Christian gospel over nearly 2 millennia are now back with a vengeance. And it's here where our story becomes very interesting because, as you're about to see, art in general and music most specifically became a primary channel for an occult revival. To understand at least the outline of the big picture here, we're going to begin with a quick history lesson. If you're not interested in these types of more academic pursuits, feel free to skip ahead a few minutes to the end of the primer. The big picture starts several hundred years ago. Beginning roughly in the 15th century, Western civilization began to experience some profound changes brought about by the confluence of a few key cultural trends and events. First, there was the Renaissance, the great age of discovery and exploration. Modern science, which as most objective historians and scientists will attest, was born out of the Christian worldview, began to experience a quantum leap in growth. Discoveries in astronomy, physics, and mathematics in particular began to hold forth the promise that man could, as Kepler said, think God's thoughts after him, and truly begin to plumb the mysteries of creation. Simultaneously, the voyages of the great explorers circumscribed the planet, dramatically expanding man's horizons and opportunities. During this same period, the printing press was invented, and suddenly there was an efficient means by which this new knowledge could be recorded and circulated. The next key movement began in 1517 when a German monk by the name of Martin Luther challenged the institutional church and launched the Reformation. Suddenly, the church, which heretofore had in many ways dominated European life and thought, was now seen as distinctly human, flawed, and as a result open to being questioned. Increasingly, scientists and philosophers, while for the most part still holding to a belief in God, began to pursue knowledge with a diminishing regard for the frame of reference of, first, the church, and then finally, God and His Word. By the 17th and 18th centuries, these movements culminated in what is commonly termed the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment. While Christian thought continued to exert great influence, particularly in England and America, more and more the architects of Western culture viewed the God hypothesis as increasingly irrelevant. Human reason was king, and by the middle of the 19th century, most notably with the publication of Darwin's Origin of the Species, the modern era was in full bloom. As Enlightenment principles took hold, however, a number of problems began to emerge, and suddenly rationalism didn't seem to be the savior so many hoped it would be. First, as the Cartesian foundation for knowledge, supplanted the classical Christian formulation, philosophers and scientists began to run up against the limits inherent in independent human thought. Slowly, the great hope of the French encyclopedists and others that man's reason alone could penetrate the mysteries of life began to crumble. By the middle of the 20th century, the twin discoveries of relativity and quantum theory nailed the coffin of classical materialism shut. Another serious setback occurred when the French Revolution, in many instances a well-intentioned experiment in Enlightenment humanism, went horribly awry. With the guillotine and the Reign of Terror, naked human reason was seen to be capable of the worst sort of atrocities. And again, the 20th century, most notably through its various communist revolutions, has only driven this point further into the ground. And finally, as far as this summary is concerned, there was the irrepressibility of the human spirit. Despite materialism's cold insistence that all that existed was matter and its motion, man's innate thirst for meaning, redemption, and transcendence simply refused to go away. And the scriptures tell us why. For he has put eternity in their hearts. This God-shaped vacuum, as the famed philosopher and mathematician Blaise Pascal called it, goes to the very core of man's existence and cannot be filled by any created thing, but only by God the Creator, made known through Jesus Christ. But, as we've just seen, this Christian solution was no longer acceptable to the supposedly enlightened architects of this modern era. New solutions had to be found, as everything from primitive naturalism, radical individualism, intense subjective experience, a classless society, psychoanalysis, and the alchemy of the subconscious mind, and altered states of consciousness were trotted out by the intelligentsia to fill the vacuum left by their rejection of God. Ironically, by the latter half of the 19th century, the great revolt against the Christian worldview, an incremental revolution that was supposedly sparked and sustained by man's bold quest for rational knowledge, had become progressively irrational, and everything that has followed in its wake has only served to confirm Chesterton's famous observation: the first effect of not believing in God is to believe in anything. Among the anythings that people began to believe are a number of irrational ideas that are still very much with us today. Belief number one: all religions are equally valid. With the foundations of Christendom being set aside, people ran everywhere in search of answers to the mysteries that science had either refused to acknowledge or failed to penetrate. European colonization in India, China, and Africa in particular sparked a major revival of Eastern and occult religions in the West. Belief number two, a corollary of number one: primitive cultures, because they are closer to man's natural, uncivilized state, contain truth the Christian West has lost or suppressed. This idea was popularized first by Rousseau and then later by the writers and artists of the Romantic school. The influential German philosopher and key initiator of the God is Dead movement, Friedrich Nietzsche, pushed the envelope even further by calling for a literal reversal of Christian values, substituting instead the will to power and a more primal, what he termed Dionysian approach to everything from philosophy to sexual ethics. And it's also quite significant that Nietzsche and other metaphysicians saw music as a primary carrier of this new ethos. In response to these potent ideas, all manner of occult thought and practice began to spread throughout Europe and eventually America. Seances and spiritualist societies became increasingly popular. Foreign service personnel, enamored with the sex cults of Hinduism, wrote tracts introducing these arcane practices to a wider audience looking not only for mystery and meaning, but new ways of gratifying their flesh. Theosophy